Was ready to divorce my wife. Then I overheard her confession to her mother. The divorce papers rested on the passenger seat beside me, tucked neatly inside a plain brown
Can't keep
envelope.
pretending everything is
Every
fine.
time I glanced at them, I felt a strange mixture of relief
He's
and
going to
grief.
have to know the truth soon.
Relief because I believed the endless arguments, the cold silences, and the unbearable distance between my wife and me would finally come to an end.
I'm home now.
Grief because this wasn't the future I had imagined the day I slipped a diamond ring onto Emily's finger 6 years earlier.
It feels like everything is falling apart.
I had promised her
we
forever.
will find a way through
Instead,
this together,
I was driving toward what I thought would be the end of our story.
Everything is falling
apart. If you're new to the channel and enjoy emotional stories filled with unexpected twists, family secrets, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.
It is okay to be a little
scared. You never
scared.
know which story might change the way you see love forever. My name is Daniel Carter, and until that Saturday afternoon, I was absolutely convinced my marriage was beyond saving. People often think marriages end because of one huge betrayal. An affair. A lie. A devastating mistake. But ours didn't fall apart overnight. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, like a house slowly sinking into the ground one tiny crack at a time. Emily used to laugh at my terrible jokes. She used to wait up for me after late shifts, no matter how tired she was. She used to grab my hand every time we crossed the street, even after years together. Somewhere along the way, all of that disappeared. Conversations became short. Dinner became silent. Goodnight kisses became memories. Eventually, even looking at each other felt like work. At first, I blamed stress. Emily worked as a pediatric nurse, often pulling 12-hour shifts. I managed operations for a logistics company, spending more time solving problems at work than at home. We were exhausted, and I assumed life would settle down eventually. It never did. Instead, the distance grew wider. I started noticing things. She smiled at her phone but barely looked at me. She canceled date nights. She stayed late at work more often. Whenever I asked if something was wrong, she'd simply say, "I'm just tired." Tired. That became the answer to everything. Why don't we talk anymore? I'm tired. Do you want to go away this weekend? I'm tired. Are you okay? I'm tired. After hearing it for nearly a year, I stopped asking. Silence became easier. One night I came home carrying flowers. It wasn't our anniversary. It wasn't her birthday. I simply wanted to remind her that I still loved her. The bouquet sat untouched on the kitchen counter for 3 days. By the time she noticed it, the roses had already started to wilt. "Oh," she said softly. "These are pretty. Pretty." That was all. No hug. No kiss. No smile. Just, pretty. That single word hurt more than any argument ever could. A few weeks later, I found myself wondering whether she even wanted to be married anymore. I hated myself for thinking it. I hated myself even more because I couldn't stop. Then came the credit card statement. There was a jewelry purchase for nearly $800. I never received anything. When I casually asked about it, Emily looked startled before quickly saying it was for a hospital fundraiser. She answered too fast. Too rehearsed. My trust cracked. Once suspicion enters your heart, everything begins to look like evidence. She laughed at texts. She hit her phone screen. She left the room to answer calls. None of it proved anything. But my imagination filled every empty space with the worst possible explanation. Friends noticed the change in me. "You look exhausted," my coworker Marcus said one afternoon. "I haven't been sleeping." Marriage. I nodded. Marcus sighed. "My first marriage ended because we stopped talking. Don't make my mistake. I wanted to believe it could still be fixed. I really did. So I suggested counseling." Emily stared at her coffee for several seconds before quietly saying, "Maybe later." Later never came. Instead, she seemed even more distant. 3 months passed. One rainy Tuesday evening, I walked into the living room and found her crying. The moment she saw me, she wiped away the tears and forced a smile. "I'm okay." No, she wasn't. Anyone could see that. But she refused to tell me why. I reached for her hand. She gently pulled it away. That tiny movement shattered something inside me. I slept in the guest room that night. Not because we argued. Because I simply couldn't bear lying beside someone who felt 1,000 miles away. Weeks later, I contacted a divorce attorney. Even saying the word made me feel sick. Divorce. It sounded like failure. Like surrender. The lawyer asked, "Are you certain?" I answered yes. But inside, I was desperately hoping someone would stop me. Someone never did. The papers arrived 5 days later. All that remained was signing them together. Emily had no idea. I planned to tell her after visiting her mother that weekend. She'd insisted we attend her mother's birthday lunch, though she seemed strangely nervous about going. Looking back now, I realize there were countless clues I completely misunderstood. That Saturday was unusually warm. Emily drove separately because she'd worked a morning shift. I arrived nearly 40 minutes late after getting stuck behind an accident on the highway. Her mother's house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with oak trees. Normally I'd walk straight through the front door. This time, I parked around the corner. I wanted a few minutes alone. I stared once more at the envelope on the passenger seat. The divorce papers. 6 years of marriage reduced to signatures on white paper. I whispered to myself, this is the right thing. The words felt hollow. As I walked toward the house, I noticed the kitchen window was slightly open. Voices drifted into the afternoon air. Emily's voice. Soft. Fragile. Then her mother's voice. Concerned. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. In fact, I intended to announce my arrival. But then I heard my own name. Daniel thinks I don't love him anymore, Emily whispered. My feet froze. Every instinct told me to keep walking. Instead, I stood perfectly still beneath the old maple tree beside the window. I see it every time he looks at me, Emily continued, her voice trembling. He thinks I've stopped caring. Her mother spoke gently. Why haven't you told him the truth? A long silence followed. When Emily finally answered, I barely recognized her voice. Because if I tell him, he'll sacrifice everything. My heart skipped a beat. Sacrifice. What was she talking about? I can't let him do that, Emily said between quiet sobs. He's worked too hard to build his career. If he knows, he'll give it all up for me. I felt the blood drain from my face. Nothing about this conversation matched the story I'd created inside my own mind. Not even close. Then Emily whispered 7 words that made the envelope in my hand slip onto the grass. I'm afraid I'm running out of time. Daniel's fingers loosened, and the brown envelope slipped silently onto the damp grass beneath the maple tree. He didn't even notice it fall. Every thought in his mind had stopped the moment Emily whispered, I'm afraid I'm running out of time. His heart pounded so loudly he wondered if they could hear it through the open kitchen window. Running out of time. The words echoed over and over until they no longer sounded real. Emily's mother spoke first, her voice shaking. Sweetheart, you can't keep carrying this by yourself. Daniel deserves to know. Emily sniffled. I know he deserves to know. That's what makes this so hard. Daniel leaned closer without realizing it, desperate to understand. I've watched him work himself to exhaustion for years, Emily continued. He finally earned the promotion he's dreamed about since we were dating. He's leading an entire division now. If I tell him the truth, he'll walk away from everything without thinking twice. Her mother sighed. And what if he wants to? I won't let him. Daniel frowned. None of this made sense. Emily had seemed cold for months. She barely smiled at him. She avoided conversations. She turned away whenever he reached for her hand. How could that possibly be love? I've already seen what caregiving did to Dad when Grandma got sick, Emily whispered. He lost his career. He lost his friends. He barely slept for years. I can't do that to Daniel. Daniel felt tears beginning to fill his eyes. Her mother answered softly, Daniel isn't your father. I know. And you're not your grandmother. I know. Then stop deciding what's best for him. Silence filled the kitchen. Finally Emily spoke again. I thought if I made him believe I didn't love him anymore, maybe he'd leave before everything became worse. Daniel's knees nearly gave way. Every cold look. Every unanswered text. Every canceled date. Every sleepless night. She hadn't been trying to hurt him. She had been trying to protect him. He covered his mouth to keep from making a sound. For months he had convinced himself she had stopped loving him. Instead, she had been sacrificing her own happiness because she believed it was the only way to save his. What did the specialist say yesterday? Her mother asked carefully. Emily hesitated. They confirmed it. Daniel held his breath. It's an aggressive neurological condition. The world around him seemed to disappear. Cars passed somewhere in the distance. Birds sang from nearby trees. Children laughed down the street. But Daniel heard only Emily. The medication can slow it, she continued, but there isn't a cure. Her mother began crying quietly. Daniel pressed one hand against the tree to steady himself. Neurological condition. No. This couldn't be happening. Emily was only 33. She spent her days caring for sick children. She exercised. She barely drank. She had always been healthy. This isn't fair, her mother whispered. Emily gave a sad laugh. No. It isn't. Daniel remembered the trembling hands she'd tried to hide several weeks earlier. She had blamed exhaustion. He remembered the headaches, the cancelled dinners, the nights she'd gone to bed early, the mornings she'd struggled to button her nurse's uniform. He had noticed every one of those moments. And he had interpreted them all the wrong way. I wanted one more normal summer, Emily said. I wanted Daniel to keep smiling. I wanted him to believe our biggest problem was simply growing apart. Her voice cracked. Instead of watching me disappear, Daniel felt something inside him break. The divorce papers. The suspicion. The resentment. Every angry thought he'd carried suddenly became unbearable. He remembered accusing her, without saying the words aloud, of hiding another man. She hadn't been hiding another man. She had been hiding her diagnosis. Her mother asked, "Have you thought about telling him after your next appointment?" Emily wiped away another tear. "I've thought about it every single day. So why haven't you?" "Because every time I look into his eyes, I lose my courage." She laughed bitterly. "I know exactly what he'll do." "What?" "He'll quit his job. He'll cancel every business trip. He'll sell the house if he has to. He'll spend every minute trying to save me." She looked toward the window. Daniel instinctively stepped farther behind the tree. "I love him too much to let that happen." Her mother reached across the table. "You don't get to choose his sacrifice." Emily lowered her head. "I know. She struggled to finish. "I wanted him to remember me while I could still smile." Daniel could no longer stop the tears. For nearly a year he had believed he was married to someone who had fallen out of love. Instead, he had been married to the bravest woman he had ever known. She had carried the weight of a terrifying diagnosis completely alone because she couldn't bear to see him give up his dreams. Suddenly, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He panicked and silenced it immediately. Inside the kitchen, both women fell quiet. "Did you hear something?" Emily asked. Daniel held his breath. After a few seconds her mother shook her head. "Probably just a car outside." Daniel slowly backed away from the window. His legs felt weak. He reached the front yard before bending over, trying to catch his breath. The envelope still lay beneath the tree. He stared at it. Only an hour earlier those papers represented certainty. Now they represented the biggest mistake of his life. He picked them up slowly. Then, without thinking, he opened the envelope. Page after page. Legal language. Division of assets. Signatures waiting to happen. His hands began shaking. One tear landed on the first page. Then another. Finally, with trembling fingers, he tore the papers in half. Then again. And again. Small white pieces scattered across the grass like snow. "I was wrong," he whispered. "So terribly wrong." A moment later, the front door opened. Emily stepped onto the porch, surprised to see him standing there. "There you are," she said with a tired smile. "I was wondering where you went." Daniel looked into her eyes. For the first time in months, he didn't see distance. He saw fear, pain, and overwhelming love hidden beneath both. She noticed his red eyes. "Daniel, have you been crying?" He quickly wiped his face. Allergies." She gave a faint smile. "You've never had allergies." He almost told her everything right then. He almost admitted he had overheard every word. But something stopped him. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, he walked toward her and did something neither of them had done in months. He wrapped his arms around her. Emily froze. For several long seconds she didn't move. Then she slowly hugged him back. Daniel felt her shoulders trembling against his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She pulled back just enough to look at him. "For what?" He smiled through his tears. "For not holding you sooner." Emily searched his face, confused by the sudden change. Then, for the first time in nearly a year, she rested her head against his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them knew that the hardest conversation of their lives was still waiting. And neither of them could imagine that the truth Emily had revealed today was only part of the story. Because hidden inside her hospital file was one more secret. A secret that would force Daniel to make a choice that could change both of their lives forever. Daniel barely slept that night. Emily lay beside him for the first time in months, her breathing slow and peaceful, her head resting on the pillow only inches away. To anyone looking in from the outside, they would have seemed like an ordinary married couple finally finding their way back to each other. But inside Daniel's heart, a storm raged. He knew the truth she had tried so desperately to hide. Every time she shifted in her sleep, he wondered if she was in pain. Every time she sighed, he remembered her words outside her mother's kitchen window. "I'm afraid I'm running out of time." Those 7 words echoed through his mind until sunrise. At 6 o'clock, Emily quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. Daniel kept his eyes closed as he listened to her moving around the bedroom. She paused at the dresser for a moment, then slowly opened the drawer where she kept her medications. A few seconds later, he heard the familiar rattle of a prescription bottle. His chest tightened. For months, he had assumed they were vitamins. Now he realized they were part of a battle she had been fighting alone. When she left for work, Daniel waited several minutes before getting out of bed. He walked to the dresser, opened the drawer, and found 3 orange prescription bottles tucked behind a folded sweater. His hands trembled as he read the labels. The medications weren't for exhaustion. They were prescribed by a neurologist. The dates matched the exact period when their marriage had begun falling apart. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, tears filling his eyes. She hadn't stopped loving him. She had been preparing herself for a future she believed she wouldn't survive. At work, Daniel couldn't focus. Numbers blurred together on his computer screen. Meetings came and went without him hearing a word. His assistant finally knocked on the office door. "Everything okay?" Daniel forced a smile. "Yeah." She hesitated. "You've said, yeah, 3 times this morning, and none of them sounded convincing." He looked out the window. "Have you ever realized you've been completely wrong about someone?" She smiled gently. "Happens more often than we'd like." Daniel nodded. "I made a terrible mistake." That afternoon, instead of staying late at the office, Daniel drove to the hospital where Emily worked. He didn't intend to confront her. He simply wanted to see her. From the visitors' waiting area, he watched through a glass partition as Emily knelt beside a frightened little girl no older than 6. The child clutched a stuffed rabbit while tears streamed down her face. Emily smiled warmly, gently wiping the girl's tears before handing her a colorful sticker. Within minutes, the little girl was laughing. Daniel felt another wave of emotion. This was the woman he had accused in his heart of becoming cold and distant. She still had enough love to comfort frightened children every single day, even while carrying unimaginable fear herself. One of the nurses noticed him. "Can I help you? I'm here to see Emily Carter." The nurse smiled knowingly. "Oh, her husband." Daniel nodded. "She's amazing, you know." He looked toward Emily. "I know." "No," the nurse continued softly. "You don't understand." Daniel frowned. Even after receiving difficult news a few months ago, she refused to reduce her hours. His heart skipped. The nurse quickly realized she'd said too much. "I'm sorry." Daniel shook his head. "No, thank you." She walked away. Daniel remained frozen. Emily hadn't only hidden her illness. She had hidden the strength it took to keep showing up for everyone else. That evening, Daniel made dinner. Emily looked surprised when she walked through the front door. "You cooked." He smiled. "I remembered your favorite." She stared at him for several seconds. "Is everything okay?" He nodded. "I've just missed us." A sadness crossed her face. "I've missed us too." Those 4 words nearly broke him. They sat across from each other at the dining table. For the first time in months, neither reached for a phone. Neither rushed through the meal. Instead, they talked. Not about illness. Not about divorce. Simply about life. Their first apartment. Their honeymoon. The terrible lasagna Daniel had tried to cook when they were newlyweds. Emily laughed. A real laugh. Daniel realized how desperately he had missed hearing it. For a brief moment, it almost felt like the past had returned. Then Emily's hand began trembling while she reached for her glass of water. She quickly placed it beneath the table. Pretending not to notice. Daniel pretended too. Not because he wanted to ignore it. Because he knew she wasn't ready. 3 days later, everything changed. Daniel arrived home early and found Emily sitting alone on the living room floor. Photo albums surrounded her. Wedding pictures. Vacation pictures. Christmas mornings. Birthdays. She smiled through quiet tears as she turned each page. When she noticed him, she quickly tried to close the album. "I'm just organizing." Daniel sat beside her. "No." She looked away. I'm remembering.
It
Silence
is
filled the room.
okay
Finally,
to be
Daniel
a
reached into the
little
album and pointed to one
scared.
photograph. It showed them dancing barefoot on the beach during their
We're
honeymoon. You
going
told me
to
that night we'd
take
grow old
good
together. Emily's
care
eyes
of
filled with
you.
tears. I
I
remember.
just
I still want that.
don't
She
know
closed her
what
eyes. So
to
do I.
do
Daniel gently took her hand. This
anymore.
time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his
It
fingers tightly,
feels
almost
like
desperately. Then she whispered the words Daniel had been waiting to hear. There's something I need to tell you. His heart pounded. She stood slowly and walked toward the bedroom. When she returned, she held a large white envelope. Hospital records, test results, MRI scans. She sat beside him again. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the folder. I've been lying to you. Daniel looked into her tear-filled eyes. I know. Emily froze. You know. Daniel nodded slowly. I came to your mother's house early. Her face turned pale. You heard. I heard enough. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily burst into tears. Not quiet tears. Not hidden tears. The kind that come from carrying unbearable pain for far too long. Daniel pulled her into his arms. You never had to carry this alone, he whispered. She cried against his shoulder. I was so scared. I know. I didn't want you to lose your dreams because of me. He gently lifted her chin. My dream was never the promotion. She looked at him. It was always you. Emily sobbed even harder. But before either of them could say another word, Daniel noticed something inside the medical folder. A sealed letter. Stamped with the logo of a neurological research institute. Across the front were the words. Clinical trial eligibility, immediate response required. Daniel looked at Emily. What is this? She lowered her eyes. I never answered it. Why not? Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Because the treatment is on the other side of the country. Dot and I knew you'd leave everything behind to go with me. Daniel stared at the unopened letter. For the first time since learning the truth, hope flickered in his heart. But accepting that hope would require a decision that could change both of their lives forever. Daniel picked up the unopened envelope with trembling hands. It felt impossibly light for something that might hold the weight of their future. He looked from the letter to Emily, who sat with her eyes fixed on the floor. You never even opened it? He asked softly. Emily shook her head. I couldn't. Why? Because I already knew what it would say. She took a slow, unsteady breath. My neurologist told me there was an experimental treatment program. It isn't a cure, but it has helped some patients slow the progression of the disease. The problem is, it's nearly 2,000 miles away. Daniel carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. As he read, his heartbeat quickened. Emily had been accepted into a highly selective clinical trial. There were no guarantees, but the doctors believed she was a strong candidate because her condition had been diagnosed earlier than most. The letter requested a response within 30 days. Daniel checked the date. His stomach dropped. The deadline was only 4 days away. He looked up at Emily. Why didn't you tell me? She smiled sadly. Because I knew exactly what you would do. And what would I do? You'd quit your job. Yes. You'd sell the house. If I had to. You'd put your entire life on hold. Daniel reached across the table and gently held both of her hands. Emily, you are my life. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. I never wanted to become your burden. Daniel shook his head firmly. You were never a burden. Not when we met. Not when we got married. Not today. And not a single day that comes after this. Emily covered her face as quiet sobs escaped her. For months she had carried fear, guilt, and loneliness, convinced that pushing Daniel away was an act of love. Now, hearing him speak without hesitation, she realized how much pain that decision had caused them both. I'm sorry, she whispered. Daniel pulled her into his arms. No. We're done apologizing. From this moment on, we face everything together. For the first time in nearly a year, Emily allowed herself to believe she wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Daniel walked into his office with a calmness his coworkers hadn't seen in months. He requested an immediate meeting with his manager. I need to take an extended leave of absence. His manager looked surprised. Is everything all right? Daniel hesitated only a moment. My wife is seriously ill. The room fell silent. Without another question, his manager stood and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Family comes first. Daniel felt an enormous weight lift from his chest. He had spent years believing success meant promotions, larger paychecks, and longer hours. Now he understood that success meant being exactly where the people you love need you most. That evening, Daniel and Emily drove to her mother's house. When her mother opened the door, she immediately noticed they were holding hands. Her eyes filled with tears. "You told him." Emily nodded. "I did." Daniel smiled warmly. "I should have listened to her months ago." Emily's mother hugged them both. "I've prayed every day for this moment." The three of them sat around the kitchen table for hours, making plans instead of hiding fears. They discussed travel arrangements, medical appointments, temporary housing near the research hospital. For the first time since Emily's diagnosis, hope had entered the conversation. It wasn't certainty, but it was enough. 2 days later, they boarded a flight to the city where the clinical trial was being conducted. Neither of them spoke much during takeoff. Daniel simply reached for Emily's hand. She smiled. "This feels different." "What does?" "I'm not scared anymore." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to be brave by yourself anymore." She rested her head on his shoulder as the plane climbed above the clouds. For the first time in many months, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something worth fighting for. As they landed, neither of them knew whether the treatment would succeed. But they knew something even more important. Whatever happened next, they would face it together.